Shaniqua, how are you?
I'm doing I'm doing all right. I'm doing okay.
We love the transparency, and so, folks, as we get into this conversation, feel free to fill up the chat with questions, comments, things that stick out to you. We want this to be interactive. I'm going to lead the conversation and asking questions, and when we get to our next point, we'll address the questions in the chat. So we're not ignoring you, but I want to pull out some things and just hear a little bit more of her story so that we can all learn, grow together. All right. So, Shaniqua, as I introduced you, I use this expression that comes from you, the save trauma therapist. Can you tell us what does that mean and why is that your tag or your name?
Mm. So trying to figure out a way to make a long story short. um so pretty much back in August, I decided to take a break from all social media. And I decided that because I found myself, so I do have a business page for my practice on Instagram. And I found myself comparing my page to other therapists on Instagram. And I'm like, God, I know you have a specific population for me. I know that I have my own sphere of influence, and I don't want to keep looking outside of that for inspiration or motivation or what to post. I don't want to look outside of you. And so in August, I deleted my Instagram app, and I was like, okay. So I really dug deep with God, and um, really just spent some time reflecting and going to God for instruction, and the blueprint of, okay, God, you've given me this thing, and now how would you like me to steward it? Um, and so God was giving me downloads, and I think I wrote it down. I wrote down the Save Trauma Therapist one night in prayer. And I was like, okay, God, I don't know what you want me to do with this, but I'll leave it here for now. And then maybe like a week or two later, I went to a paint night with one of my girlfriends, and we were in the car when we had a very long, deep conversation. And she's like, "What are you doing with your gifts?" And I was like, "Hmm, what am I doing with my gifts? Good question." And she's like, "Well, I know, you're doing your practice, so you have your natural gifts, but what about your spiritual gifts? What are you doing?" And I was like, "That's a really good question." Um, and she said, "You ever think about merging the two, your natural and your spiritual gifts?" And I was like, "Huh, that's funny." It's funny you say that. And I was telling her about this name that God gave me and how I've been thinking about it. And so I want to say this was in maybe November or so. So I started the fast, the social media fast in August. And then November, I'm like, all right, God, what am I to do with this Save Trauma Therapist? My friend gave me this confirmation. She be speaking some things. She gave me this confirmation. I know it's from you. And what do you want me to do with it? And I was like, okay, maybe I'll do blog posts, and I already have a website. I have my practice website. So I'll just use that, and I'll put a section up there for blog posts. And the title will be the Safe Trauma Therapist. And literally God was like, no shortcuts. So I was like, okay, God, you want me to create an entirely new website, huh? So I created an entirely new website, and it's my blogging website. And yeah, so that's where the long story short, that's where the name came from, the Save Trauma Therapist. So merging um, what I do um, as my profession, therapist, and also my faith, and merging the two together.
God used a friend to confirm that there needed to be a merging of your life, right? To where like your faith and your practice could come together.
Yeah.
So, so you're a Connecticut-based therapist, and so I would love for you to share a little bit about. Did you always know that you wanted to be a therapist, or how did that happen? Like, how did you get to this point of becoming a licensed trauma therapist? And yeah, if you could just share with us a little bit about your journey to that.
Yeah. So I think deep down, I always knew I wanted to be a therapist. Originally, I thought I wanted to be a marriage and family therapist. And, you know, I think that where we end up in life, our story is almost a path to our destination, right? And so thinking about my story and, how my childhood was, what I grew up in, and what I experienced. I experienced therapy as a child. I went to family therapy, and I also did individual therapy as a child. And so I think from there, that is where the seed was planted. And then, I grew up and like I wanted to be all these different things, trying out all these different things, exploration as we do in adolescence. Um, and then it wasn't until senior year of high school, looking at college applications and such, applying and, recruiters coming to my high school. And I was like, maybe I'll do psychology. So my freshman year, I went in undeclared. And then after a few classes, after the first semester, I declared as psychology. And I kept that major for maybe 2 semesters. And then I ran into um, this guy that I remember from my high school. He was a recruiter. And he had asked my roommate and I, oh, what did you guys declare as your majors? And I said psychology, and she said criminal justice. And he looked at me, he was like, psychology? That's not practical. You're not gonna make any money in that. And I was like, maybe this man is right. He's an adult, adulting, he has a career. He seems pretty stable, so maybe he's right. Psychology isn't practical. And I changed my major after that. I spent maybe another semester in the major, and then I changed it. Um, and then I graduated with a bachelor's degree in communication. I'm like, what am I going to do with this? And I promised myself that I was not going back to school. I'm like, I am not going back to school. Forget that. I am so tired. And so I graduated in a December semester, and thinking about, okay, what am I going to do? What am I going to do? And literally God was like, you're going back to school. I was like, oh my gosh, okay, I'm going back to school. So I graduated in December, and then we didn't have a winter ceremony back in 2016. So I walked that following May. And then literally the day after the actual ceremony, I started grad school. So that's my journey.
How do we find ourselves in purpose? And then even when those conflicting voices tell us otherwise, you had that moment where it's like, oh, that's not practical. It caused you to pivot and shift, but obviously there was something still in you that was leading and pulling, and you identified that it was God. And so it's really interesting to me that you also had grown up and experienced counseling therapy throughout your life. Uh, was it was it ever difficult for you once you made that decision to go to grad school to follow this path? And like, yeah, was it supported by your family and your faith community and others, or was there sort of resistance or questioning around you following that path?
So I wouldn't say there was resistance, but it was unfamiliar for them because of that stigma of therapy within, families of color. And so there was no resistance. I think that I had a lot of freedom to choose what I wanted to do to an extent, as far as, career and majors. And so I did get a little, looks. So with my brothers, I am the only one of my siblings who went to college, graduated college, and then went on to grad school. And so, they looked at me sideways a little, like, therapy. Why would you want to be a therapist? Be something that we could benefit from. They wanted me to do law, to be a lawyer. And I'm like, no, this is for me. And one thing I will point out is how God redirected me so many times. And even in those moments where I was unsure, like, God, I'm not really sure about this. I don't know if this is for me. I would always be redirected.
When you think about your path, why trauma? Why is trauma so important to you, and what is the distinction, I guess? And you had this fork in the road of like, is it family, counseling and therapy, or doing trauma? Why
Mhm.
trauma, and like what's that about for you?
Yeah. So even in the beginning of my program, my grad program, I was still focused towards marriage and family therapy. And it wasn't until maybe my last semester of grad school where I said, huh, I don't want to work with couples. I can work with couples if I choose to. I'm not limited, but I want to focus on something that is so near and dear to me, which is trauma, something that I know a lot about through my own experience. And learning more about trauma also benefited me.
Hmm.
So yes, it benefits my clients, but it benefited me first. So being trained in trauma and learning and just going through the different programs, the trainings definitely benefited me first and then my clients.
Hmm. So when you talk a little bit about the intersection of your wanting to serve and help other people, but really through this lens of your own journey to healing, uh, to your discretion, could you talk a little bit about what role trauma had in your life and how that helped inform you that, hey, I need to go on this journey of healing and that this could help other people, but like you said, it helped you first. And so could you tell us a
Mhm.
little bit about like where trauma showed up in your life and how it affected you?
Yeah. So another long story, but I'll try to be as clear and concise as I can be. So trauma definitely started in the womb for me. Um, while my mother was pregnant, she was using, and so I was born addicted to crack cocaine. And for the first 3 months of my life, I was in the hospital. And then finally, they took me home, and she was still struggling. Both of my parents really were struggling with addiction. And eventually, my grandmother had custody of me and my siblings. And so for a while, I bounced around from parents' house to grandma's house to parents' house to just mom to just dad. And so it was really unstable until about third grade. And I finally decided, I said, okay, I want to live permanently with my grandma. And that's what I did.
All of that early trauma, how did that show up or affect you throughout your adolescence, teenagehood,
Mm,
college? Like how did it show up there?
yeah, that's a good question. So trauma shows up differently for everyone. And so for me, the way that the trauma I experienced showed up, how it manifested is it showed up through resentment, anger,
Mm.
um, depression, sadness, deep, deep sadness. Um, the fear of abandonment and rejection. And so I was so resentful and so angry at my parents for not being what I needed them to be. And so, you think of an adolescent and how they are also going through their own changes and stages, right? And so going through changes at that age and also dealing with the suitcases of stuff that I brought with me. And I mean, suitcases like emotional baggage and such of stuff from childhood, bringing it into adolescence, and then bringing it into emerging adulthood. And it wasn't until grad school that I started therapy, and that was because the director, it wasn't a requirement, but it was more so of a strong suggestion that we all be in our own therapy. And I'm like, I mean, I guess I did that when I was younger, but whatever, I guess I'll do it. And so at this point, me starting therapy in grad school, a lot happened since then. So in that span of time, I lost my mother. So my mother died. One of my brothers was killed, and that was in the same year. And so starting grad school in 2017, 2 years after all of this happened, I was like, okay, fine. I guess I'll look for a therapist. So I did. I found one, and I worked through, and also still working through. So I often tell my clients that healing is not linear, and some days will look exactly the same, and some days will look different. And so you can come into therapy focused on one thing, and then the next week be focused on something else. And maybe a few months later, you find yourself in that same space you were when you first started. Like, dang, I thought I was over this. I thought I healed from this. And so that was me. That was my process.
What's really powerful is, and something that I want to know a little bit more about, and thank you for sharing your story and these experiences. And I think the goal of these conversations is to get this practical understanding, but really engage with you as a human being who's doing this and living this. And it seems like all of that build up and trauma that you had to work through, even in the midst of pain and of loss, and as you said, you're still working through. I would love to for you to shed a little bit of light on, when did you come to faith in Jesus, and how did that intersect with your journey in grad school and working through your trauma, and really you seeing these two pieces sort of connecting. So yeah, what's a little bit about your journey to faith in the midst of all of this, this pain and hurt and abandonment and everything else?
So I pretty much grew up in church. And I think everyone says that. But it wasn't until these things happened to me. So when grief was so unbearable, that's when I really decided to get serious and have my own personal relationship with God. And so I grew up in church. My grandma forcing me and my siblings to be in Sunday school every Sunday, join the choir, all of that. And so I want to say 2015, yeah, maybe December 2015 is when I really said, okay, God, I am tired. I'm tired of doing the same thing over and over again and feeling the same way. Help me. And so in that moment is when I really rededicated my life back to Christ. And so starting grad school, going through grad school, In my first semester of grad school, I remember this so clearly. We had an assignment. We had to listen to a podcast, and I think the guy was talking about his faith. And so our assignment was to respond to the podcast and, make a paper about it. And so I'm writing my paper, and in the paper, I'm like, I wish he would have spoke more about his faith and how he intertwined, because he was a therapist, so how he intertwined the two. And then I talked about my own faith, and I talked about how I want to incorporate that in my practice. And so I submitted my assignment, and the comment that I got back was, "You can't do that." And pretty much he said, "You can't do that. It's sticky. That's a really sticky situation." And I think he had linked the code of ethics. And so somewhere in the code of ethics for licensed counselors, it says that you can't, there's a section on religion and how we can't, force our religion on any of our clients. And so, that's not what I was saying at all that I wanted to do, but pretty much what he was doing in that moment was projecting his own experience with faith. Um, and it sounded like he had a not so good experience. And so he was telling me, no, you can't do that. You can't intersect the two. And so at that, I was like, oh, okay. I guess I won't talk about faith in my papers anymore. And so I didn't talk about faith in my papers anymore. That didn't stop me from, still believing and still going through grad school with God, but I just didn't talk about it in my papers. Yeah.
Wow. So with that in discouragement of intertwining, and now you're at a place where you're a lot more vocal about how they do intertwine. Could you share a little bit about the season that you're in right now and how you're seeing intersections and why you talk about the space where faith and mental health coexist? Why is that so important to you?
Mm. So the season I'm in right now is, if I had to put a name to it, I think I'd title it The Uncovering. And so I say that because um, God has me writing a lot of blog posts about my life, not just something so surface level, but dig deep, make it personal, because somebody needs to hear what you went through, what you grew through, what you healed through. And somebody needs to see that you came out of it and you're still working through life, right? And I was like, God, you know how I am. You know how I am, God. I'm a very private person. I've always been a very private person. And I really, I keep that very close. And so I'm like, you want me to tell the internet all of my business? God is like, yeah, because it's not your business. And so I was like, okay, I guess that's what I have to do. And that was literally the scariest thing about this entire journey, is making what was private for me public and telling my story. And there's so much power in storytelling. Um, and so, yeah, that's the season that I'm in right now. Definitely an uncovering and revealing and allowing other people in, to an extent, but allowing other people to really see what it looks like and what the impact that trauma has on ourselves, on our spirits, on our bodies, really, and how to work through it, how to heal and do it with God, and really how God sees us in the midst of everything we go through.
That's really powerful. So a couple more questions, and then I want to remind folks as we're engaged in this conversation, feel free to put some questions or comments and stuff in the chat because we want to end with some of those. But I love your expression around storytelling and how telling your story is powerful. And there's a lot of stereotypes I think of like therapists because I think most of us are introduced to the idea of therapy through movies, right? So there's a character on a show or there's a therapist and they act and behave a certain way. And so the question I really want to ask, one of the final ones, is you talked about in your story a little bit about how you were exploring and doing a lot of different things, but I also know that you do poetry and you do these other things. Where does that come from, and how do you use that as a way to do your larger work of helping people heal?
Mm. So the other forms of expression really developed at a young age for me because I was not able to verbally express myself. And I've always had a problem with verbally expressing. And so I remember my grandma telling me the story of, my first words and how I didn't speak until I was almost 3. I didn't say a word until I was almost 3. And yeah, so verbal expression was really a struggle for me growing up. And, I learned how to speak eventually, and I was good at talking, but expressing on a deeper level, emotionally, what I'm feeling, what I need, I had no idea how to. And really that's because I didn't have a model, an example. And so what I used to do was I used to write my grandma different little letters and give it to her and have her read it instead of me saying things. And so I would write something and then and say, here, and she would just read it and respond. And then if she needed me to respond and I wasn't able to or comfortable enough to speak it, I would write it out and give it to her. And so writing really, that was definitely an outlet for me. And I love spoken word, and I love it because there's really no limits, and you can get as creative and as expressive as you want to. So it's just different means of expression for me. So spoken word, painting, I love to paint, um, taking pictures, videography. Yeah.
Hmm. From your perspective, when you think about these other forms of expression and how you're utilizing them as a person, but also even in your work, I wanted to just ask you, from you can answer from your perspective, but what is therapy? And you know, you're the safe trauma therapist, but what is therapy? And maybe share with us a little bit about like your approach and how it's different.
Yeah. So therapy is pretty much, in the simplest of terms, I'd say therapy is the treatment of a past or present problem, right? So I think a lot of people think about therapy and automatically assume that they'll be laying on a couch and um, their therapist will be sitting in the chair and just writing. And it can be like that, but 9 times out of 10, it is not like that at all. So there's definitely different forms of therapy. The most common one is talk therapy, um, which is pretty much, say, you and I in a session just talking. And every therapist has their own style. So some therapists may talk less and let the client do most of the talking, and then other therapists may do most of the talking if they have a client who is not really comfortable expressing themselves. And so, yeah, definitely looks different for every therapist. Every person is going to experience different therapy in a different way. And so, my way of therapy is I incorporate different forms. So, talk therapy for the most part, but more so trauma therapy and digging deep into childhood trauma because what we went through in childhood plays a direct impact on who we are as adults and how we navigate the world.
So yes, no, I have one more, and then I want to open it up to the questions in the chat. And but thank you again for sharing, and I hope folks who are listening in are gaining a lot from it and just learning about a human being who's a child of God and is following this way and is serious about helping heal the world in the ways that she's called to. So it's really inspiring. I might go back to school and change my major too. I don't know. We got to change our majors. But so one question I wanted to ask, and then we'll switch it over to other folks, is what would you say is your vision or your mission overall with the Save Trauma Therapist and just with your practice in general? Like you're young in your life and in your career, but what do you hope to do? Like what are some visions and dreams you have?
hmm So, one word that has been ringing so heavy for me this year is impact. And so, that's what I want. I want to make impact. And I was having this conversation a few weeks ago about how everyone wants a platform or wants an audience, and thinking about social media. Um, and I was saying how our lives are platforms first and foremost, and how we are to use our lives to make impact. Yeah, social media is cool to reach different people, but reach the people that are closest to you first and foremost, using your life as your platform, because we are called to make impact here on this earth. We're called to shake up the earth, right? And so, yeah, making impact is most important for me. It doesn't matter if I have 15 clients or 3 clients, making impact. So I guess that's what I want you guys to really take away from this is you never know who is on the other side of your obedience. You never know who's on the other side of your story, of what you went through, the trauma that you experienced. You never know who's on the other side of your yes, of you saying yes to healing, saying yes to God. And so knowing that, okay, if I'm called to make impact here on this earth, what can I do? God, what do you need me to do? What do you need me to do? And I know that you see me. I know that you love me. I know that you accept me as I am, and you see me and what I'm going through. Now, how can I use what I went through to make an impact for someone else?
You said something really, really powerful, and that I want all of us to take in and see for our own lives, and maybe through you following a particular pathway, but the other side of our obedience, and that we're living for more than just us. And so I
Yeah.
want to address some of the questions in the chat, and we're gonna sit and talk about these, and folks who yeah, please stay on and hang out with us to hear the answers, and then I'll share a couple thoughts, and then we'll wrap up. But thank you, this has been really, really amazing. So the first question is, how does your faithfulness to God to your faithfulness in your practice? In other words, can you describe how your faithfulness to godly disciplines in your life influences how you care for people or the quality of care you provide to people? So drawing a little bit of that connection
Mhm.
up. You just elaborate. It's kind of come out, but
Yeah.
feel free to add.
Yeah. So that's a good question. I think for me, if I'm depleted spiritually, then I will not be able to show up 100% for my clients. And so I make sure that I'm always filling up because I'm so deeply connected to people in such an intimate way, knowing the ins and outs of what they experience of their life, of who they are. It's important for me as someone who's a licensed therapist, but also called by God. And I do believe that every one of my clients are for me. So they're not just by happenstance, right? So God divinely connects each and every one of my clients to me for a reason, because they need what God has placed in me for them.
Mhm.
And so if I'm not doing what I have to do spiritually, then again, so somebody is on the other side, right? So if I'm not doing what I have to do and in my secret place with Papa, then someone else, my clients, may not get what they need in that session if I'm not 100%. And so I can go into a session with my spiritual tank on E, yes, but I will be only operating from education, from my schooling. And I know that there's so much more than that. And so there's some things that I didn't learn in school that God has given me direct downloads of. And that's why it's so important for me, especially to really make sure that my spiritual tank is full and also that I'm praying before every session.
And when I operate on E, I'm operating from education. That's like a bar. We got to work on. Maybe put that in a poem. Oh, I love it. So the next question is being a person of faith, how do you refrain from just telling somebody to seek Christ?
Mm. Huh.
Or maybe you don't refrain.
No, no. I think I've never been the type to say that. I've heard that a lot growing up in church. You know, just pray about it, just pray about it. And yes, praying about it is number one. And also, you can pray about it, and God will send you to a therapist. God will send you to someone because God made therapists too, right? We are all God made, and for a reason, for a purpose. And so I can pray about a thing, and God will lead me directly to a professional to help me with that thing. And so, yeah, I don't, I definitely, I'm a huge advocate for Jesus and therapy, right? In conjunction, you know? And so, yeah,
Love it.
I don't go towards that at all.
Mm, great. And so, with this next question, someone is very inspired by your thoughts on your grad school experience, and they want to ask how you allowed that to work for you in forms of your spiritual growth and also building a secure career path. So, yeah, you just like when you get to that moment and you understand that it's purpose driven, it's purpose called, but also there is this concern about stability, security, but also you growing spiritually. So if you just want to talk about how those things really coalesce in the grad school experience.
Hmm. I guess what I did was I held on to that word that God gave me originally. And so when God gives you a word, hold on to that, even if what's in front of you does not match it, even if you're going through and it doesn't really feel, I'm like, God, I don't know, this doesn't feel right, or I don't know if I'm on the right path, or it feels like I'm failing, or I'm not good enough, or I'm not fit for this field. And I've had a lot of moments like that in grad school. I was okay, there was one other Black girl in my class, in my entire graduating class. And so me and the other Black girl, we were in our 20s. Everyone else was maybe like 40s and up, had they already had 2 and 3 careers, and this is a career change for them. And, be me going into it as my first career, like, okay, I'm fresh out of undergrad and I have no idea what I'm doing. And so in that, there was a lot of, for me, imposter syndrome, and how I felt so intimidated or less than, being in a classroom full of people who have already lived and have had multiple careers. Um, and so what I had to do was hold on to what God said about me, about who he said I would become, who he said I was in that moment, and what he told me to do. So even if my feelings didn't match up, thank God that God does not operate based on my feelings, because if he did, things would have changed so many times. Um, and so, yeah, I definitely had to hold on to what God told me, regardless of, what that professor, the feedback that that professor gave me, and what people say about um, mixing, that fine line between religion and school or politics or whatever they say. Um, Holding on to the word that God gave you. So if you're in something, and if you're leaning towards a specific path, I'd say definitely hold on to that original word that God gave you, regardless of what it looks like in front of you, regardless of every fear that you may have about that path. Well, God, I don't know if this is going to be good. I don't know if I'm going to succeed in this. I don't know if this will make me money or I'll be stable in it. If God is calling you to something, then know that it is good, because God says that it's good, right? So the things that God gives us, every gift he gives us is good, right? And so thinking about it that way, well, God, if you're calling me to this, then it must be good. Then I must succeed in this. Then this is for me, because you know all and you're calling me to this. You know what's on the other side of this. Even in this moment, I may not know where I'll be in 4 years, but you know.
All right, so we got a few more, and these are all really good, and we know this is so beneficial to so many of us. So the next question is, how do you recommend I get someone to therapy who seems to be afraid to take that leap and be vulnerable? This person tells me that I'm their therapist, and seeing so much healing myself, I want so bad for them to take that leap. So what do you say to that?
So I say you're not their therapist unless unless you are their therapist. Um, Venting to friends is a great outlet, but it is not therapy. And so I would definitely recommend that you intercede on their behalf. Go to God about it, and ask God to put it on their hearts to find a therapist. And if this is somebody close to you, maybe you can even find a few and send them a list. Hey, I've been thinking about you, and I think that you really benefit from talking to somebody who's not me, a professional, right? And so sending them a list. And one thing I will say from experience is, forcing someone to go to therapy never works. They have to go on their time. They have to go when they will benefit from it most. Because if you force someone to go, first they may not be ready, right? They may not be in a space to do it mentally, emotionally. And so I say definitely just intercede on their behalf. Go to God for them about about that thing that you believe that they can use more assistance in.
It's really great, and I know in our emotion series we talked about boundaries and how one of the keys for us to staying emotionally healthy is also not uh, crossing the boundary of understanding that at the end of the day, everyone is an individual and has to take accountability, responsibility for their life, and we can't push or force people to do things. And so when it becomes a burden, like, this really needs to happen, we have to also kind of step back and just be prayerful, be patient, and hopefully they do. But if not, we just gotta rock with it. So a couple more questions. One is, you talked about different approaches to your client as a therapist. Do you change your style or approach often, or do you try to stick to a general approach? Or how do you go about determining your approach to a client? What are some things you look for in clients and a client's demeanor to determine your approach? So a couple of those questions, just like, do you
Yeah,
change it
those are
often?
really good questions.
Yeah.
And so I think my foundation stays the same. The way I approach it will be different depending on each client because, some, like I said earlier, you'll have a client who is more talkative, and then you'll have a client who is more reserved. And so I really play it by ear, and I cater to what that client needs. So it's not to say that I'm if this client comes in and she's struggling with eating disorders, that I'm going to do a 360, right? And just focus on that because I have no experience. I have no foundation in eating disorders. That's not my sphere of influence. And so with that client, if she comes in, I would most likely refer her out to someone else who is experienced and who specializes in eating disorders. So for me, my foundation is trauma work, and every, I don't want to say surface level, but for lack of a better word, every surface level problem or thing, ailment that we deal with has a deeper root. And if we don't get to the deeper root, these things will still pop up. So even if we were working through something, right, and maybe a few months later, it pops up again, we're like, dang, I thought I healed from that. I thought I worked from that. I thought I worked through that already. And you didn't. I mean, you worked through it, right? But you didn't get to the roots of it. And so I say all that to say my foundation stays the same. And I do primarily trauma work. And so the approach may change depending on the client, but the foundation stays the same.
What would you say to a person who is like, well, I'm a believer and I feel like I want to go to therapy? How will my faith and therapy work together as opposed to feeling like they're on the opposite ends of like the one or the other? So like how would they
Hmm.
work together? Like, how does my faith in Jesus
Okay.
plus counseling help me?
Yeah. So I think that a lot of people focus so much on the spiritual aspect that they ignore the natural, they ignore what is going on in their bodies. And so it complements in a way that you can be 100 spiritually, right? But maybe you're at a 5 or a 0 in your body. And so make sure I say this right. Shifting the focus and knowing that, okay, well, if God created me, then he knows every single thing about me. He knows what I've gone through. He knows what I will go through. He knows every trauma, every hurt, every pain, every heartbreak. And God sees me in my mess. God sees me in this trauma. And also, he promises to not leave me there. And so that's how it complements, because God wants us to heal. God promises healing, right? And not just spiritually, but physically, mentally, emotionally. Um, so yeah, I think that's how it complements, how therapy, how counseling can complement rather than conflict.
Yeah, because there's a practicality to healing overall, right? So even with physical, we have medicine, but even when you go through physical therapy, you've experienced like some sort of physical trauma. You're working with someone to work the muscles back, but to also kind of get it back to proper functionality. And we know our brain is a muscle, and we're learning all of these different things about our bodies. And so, in the same way, what you're pointing to is that you have the faith in God that He provides the tools to also practically work out healing, and that there are some healings that come, as we've seen in New Testament, to where it's like, hey, Jesus said, get up and walk. Person is walking. But there's other processes that God also uses at
Yeah,
His own discretion and for His own reasons that we kind of work through, which is really, really great. So, with the
yeah,
time that we have left, wanted to just dive into and connect it to the next question. But this person says, oftentimes we start carrying baggage from our lives that we were never meant to carry, which kind of goes back to your work around childhood trauma. Christ offers us an invitation to be yoked with Him, exchanging our baggage for His light burden. What would you say are some practical steps to shedding baggage, especially those pieces that seem to keep reoccurring or relapse? So you said that in a couple of examples, like you have that moment where you feel like you work through something and then it comes up again. What are some practical steps to like getting rid of some of that baggage though, so that we don't always come back to them or to relapse, if you will?
yeah. I guess first acknowledge and recognize what's in the baggage, what's in those suitcases. What are those patterns? Identify what the patterns are. What are those things that you find keep coming up? What are those things? And so when you identify them, I'd say write them down, write everything down, because sometimes we can be so stuck in our minds and we stay there. And so do a brain dump. And a brain dump is pretty much writing out everything that is going on in your mind, every thought that comes up. So write it all out. Start with identifying, okay, what are the reoccurring patterns in my life? What are some things that I notice that I keep doing, or maybe some people that I gravitate towards, people I find myself always connected with, or maybe I'm always connected with the wrong people, or these friendships that I have don't really last. Identify those patterns, and so in doing that, you can point out the cycle and think of it as a triangle, right? And so the top part of the triangle would be the activating thought. So what's that thought? That thought that starts that cycle. And then say the next point right there would be a belief. And so from a thought, that cultivates a belief. And then from that belief, let's say behavior. So from that belief, there's a behavior, and then so on and so forth. You're in that cycle, right? And so, how do I interrupt this cycle? Well, either change the belief or change the behavior. And even thinking about that, I say and or, because it's kind of hard to determine which one comes first because it happens so quickly. And so, okay, well, what's the belief? What are some of the beliefs that have been ingrained in me? And where do these beliefs come from? Are they from me, or are they from my parents or grandparents? Um, and also the behavior. Is this behavior as a result of a fear, or as a result of something that happened to me, a trigger or a trauma that I've experienced, or does it have to do with what is actually in front of me?
Mm. Ooh, that triangle that's gonna stay with us. We're gonna have to revisit that always. So thank you so much. So two more questions. One of the last questions is that, well, at the time this is happening, it's Black History Month, Black Future Month, Black People Year, whatever you want to call it. Oftentimes in the Black community or communities of color, therapy is looked down upon because the response is often, "You don't need that," or "You ain't depressed." And this person says that, "I know you've been in counseling before, so that was your experience with being encouraged to go into therapy. And what would you say to Black individuals who don't deem therapy a necessity for mental stability, or this idea that something is wrong with you in order to go to therapy?
So first I'd say therapy is for everyone. You don't have to be in crisis to find a therapist to start therapy. You don't have to there isn't anything wrong with you. Um and so yeah, therapy is not just for the sick,
Mm.
so to speak. It's that reminds me of when Jesus said, um, he didn't come just for the healthy, right? For the sick. And I'd say therapy is for the healthy and for the sick. You don't have to be in crisis. You don't have to have something wrong with you. You don't have to be depressed or anxious. Therapy is for personal growth. Therapy is for venting. Therapy is for exploration. Therapy is for digging up past traumas or identifying different patterns that you would like to interrupt, different cycles, generational curses that you notice in your family. Um, and so, what I'd say to every Black and Brown person is to don't knock it until you try it, right? I think that a lot of, especially, I want to say older generations, are so stuck in a way of relying on our medical system. Um, I don't know about you guys, but I hear this a lot from like my grandma and older. Well, the doctor said this, so I guess I have to do this. Or, oh no, the doctor said I have to do this. And oh, the doctor said, oh, I need to take these and I need to take these, and a long list of prescriptions, right? And so being stuck in even that mindset of, well, this person said this and they must know what they're talking about because they're a professional. So this is what I'm gonna do. But I find it funny that when it comes to therapy, none of that, all of that is just thrown out the window, right? And so, yeah, I'd say to every person of color who has that mindset of, um, if you go to therapy, then you're crazy or something must be wrong with you, or you ain't depressed, or you don't need that. We don't go to therapy. We don't discuss what happened in our house. Yeah, definitely letting them know that the times have changed and depression shows up in many different forms. And so overworking is depression. That can be depression. Um, Surviving, being in constant survival mode, that's a trauma response. And so whether they know it or not, and whether they like it or not, I think everyone needs therapy. Imagine if, I always think about this, but imagine if everyone was working through what they went through. If everyone was on their journey to healing, to rediscovering themselves, if everyone was on their journey to becoming and making impact, imagine, just imagine.
What a world that would be. Well, you actually answered the last question already. Someone had asked, like, do you think everyone could benefit from therapy? And so we want to end with that note, and just
Mhm.
say thank you for sharing your story, for sharing space with us. It's been a privilege. It's been an honor and a blessing, and we're going to continue to pray for you in your practice and in your life. For folks who are able to join us over the summer at the first From the Well service, you heard the amazing horn section. One of the horn players happens to be her husband, incredible human being, and they have a YouTube channel that they're sharing about their life and their marriage. And we're going to put all the information in the chat. We've sent it out to email for those who are subscribed to our email. And if you're not subscribed, you can definitely get subscribed today. And just get more content, because we want to continue to follow your journey and invite you back into space to answer more questions or ways that folks can continue to stay connected with you. And as we wrap, I wanted to rehash the thoughts that we had shared, especially last week, because in this space, as we're looking at it from the faith perspective of the Christian worldview, we really want to highlight and lift up the belief system that we're operating from, and you can adapt it as you need. But really, the ultimate reality is that we believe that because of this fall, this separation through the disobedience with humanity, that it was a traumatic event, and that because of this disruption in the relationship between creator and creation, that there is dysfunction and sin as a nature. This idea that sin is ignoring God and the world that he has created and made, it makes us dysfunctional human beings who are enslaved to idolatry, meaning serving created things rather than the creator, and enthralled with evil, causing harm to self and others. But we believe that Jesus comes to interrupt the traumatic patterns of human existence, to offer healing and eternal life through a restored relationship, and that gift of this restored relationship is also experienced through healing that is comprised of moments and a lengthy journey through therapy, through counseling, and through care. And Jesus, we believe, is the ultimate bearer of all trauma. That on that cross, he bore all trauma. He continues to bear our trauma in many different ways. And we want to lift up and support one another, regardless of your faith background or experiences or where you're at. We believe firmly that we are called to love, to serve, and to care. And Shaniqua is one of those faithful practitioners who is caring for humanity, and we're encouraging everyone to find alignment with the gifts and abilities that God has given you in order to serve the world, to care for humanity, and to do it at the best of your ability, but in his grace as he empowers us. Because something that I'm really going to take away is that if I come up and I show up on E because I'm not investing in myself, in my time with the Lord, I'll show up on empty, but I'll just be operating off of education. And we want to go beyond what we're just given, and really what he gives us is a really, really beautiful thought. So as we wrap up, I just want to remind you through this quote from Allison Cook that the enemy of your soul will try to compound your trauma by telling you to give up and hide. Instead, take steps each day to turn toward the good, the beauty, the small steps towards healing that help you feel alive. Jesus came to give us life, and so we want you to take steps towards feeling alive. And we want to thank Shaniqua for being with us. And we shared some questions. So as we wrap up, please feel free to share anything that you're taking away, say your thanks, and we'll definitely make sure that everything is there in the chat, and we'll go from there. Okay. So for home, you can do this when you're home. Think of a moment when you were hurt. Write a letter to yourself in that moment from the perspective of now, and then seek the Lord and other support to explore the various emotions that come up for you. Ask God to help you overcome any emotions that may be lingering. We really want to just do these practice exercises really just to help us to use writing, as Shaniqua pointed out, as a way to sort of help us. And it's really amazing that you said you used to write to your grandmother. And so yeah, write a letter to yourself in that moment, and seek the Lord and other support. We encourage you to seek pastoral counseling if you're not belonging to a space or just a trusted source. But then, as Shaniqua helped us identify, just because we use it as a common vernacular in our culture of like, oh yeah, this is my therapist, or this person's my therapist, or yeah, my therapist is Twitter, or my friend on Instagram, whatever. We want to lift up that these are licensed, trained professionals, and we thank God that she went through the schooling and has real practical tools and resources to help us. All right. So we thank you for joining us, everyone, for being in space, and continue to use the chat to show love. Thank you. We cannot thank you enough, Shaniqua, for being present and being in space with us. Everyone, please stay connected. We have a YouTube channel where all of the sessions are available. We've been doing Truthseekers since 2015, but really in 2020, we started recording and releasing the session covering every topic you can imagine. And we just so happen to be in a conversation about trauma now, but feel free to go back to the archives to share this out. The opening part of this, as well as the conversation, will be available on YouTube. So if you want to revisit it, but also share it out, I believe that there's healing and that there's hope in these conversations because Jesus is in them, and we have to just feed ourselves and the world hope and joy. And so thank you for joining us. And what we'd like to do to close out here is pray. And so I'm just going to say a prayer over us, and we'll go about the rest of our evenings in our lives. Father, we thank you again for this time. We pray that your love would lead us. Thank you for seeing us. Thank you for helping us not feel alone. Trauma is vicious in the ways in which we experience pain and wounds in our soul. But thank you, Lord, that you declared yourself a healer and that you're using vessels like Shaniqua to help in that process. And even when we're not in crisis, we know that you've given tools, resources, and knowledge to help us work through ourselves and what we've been through. Thank you, Lord, for giving that gift to us. We pray that you would encourage us and strengthen us. And we're praying a special prayer over Shaniqua and her husband and the life that she's building and the practice that she's leading, and even her blog. We pray, Lord, that you would build the platform that you're calling her to, that you would give her settledness and rest, and that you would steer people to her direction that need her, and that you would even strengthen her in her moments of weakness, and even silence the voices of discouragement, of inadequacy, imposter syndrome, anything that would hinder her from being the fullness that you're calling her to be. We know that you have her in this world, and we're all grateful to have met her and to know her in this time. Protect and keep everyone that's in this space. Help them to feel your love and to feel your care, even in the midst of the chaos and calamity in our worlds as well as in our own heads. We thank you and we praise you. In Jesus' name, amen.